So we're checking in with Kevin IOLE on MMA. Of course, he's not really covering MMA this week as much as he normally does because he's covering boxing. He's down in Dallas covering Pac-Man and Claudia, but there's always something going on in MMA. We're going to try to do a lot of these where we do quick hits with Kevin because he's connected as much as anyone. So we got to get some updates on James Toney and what's happening with James, Ultimate Fight Night 22, the whole Montreal thing. So what's the latest with James Toney?
Well, the latest with James Toney is not who he is fighting, Steve, but who he's not fighting. It's not going to be Kimbo Slice, contrary to what everybody thought. And in fact, Kimbo is going to fight Matt Montreal, which I think is an intriguing fight. It's a fight that, I'm interested in seeing, and I never really thought I would say about a Kimbo fight that I'd want to see it, but that's a fight that I think could be interesting. James Toney, I talked to Dana on Monday, and he said they still aren't sure where they're going to go with James. The last time I spoke to James, he told me he thought he would box in April. Obviously it's getting close he's got to make a decision. So my guess is that he's going to probably do that because it's been about 6 months since he's been in the ring. He told me he wanted to just, fight once to get the rust off and then go into MMA. So my guess is what he said to me originally when I interviewed him after he signed with the UFC is going to hold, that he will go ahead and fight boxing in April, May, and then go ahead and fight MMA in June or July.
So if Mitrione, and they've sent out a release, I think it was yesterday, Mitrione and Kimbo are still slated for Montreal in early May. What does that mean? I mean, how do you put together a big main event? I figured they would try to do a slam dunk main event. Kimbo would be part of it for that Ultimate Fight Night 22 on the 17th of April.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting because now Swick is not going to be able to fight Mike Serra. Matt Serra, that was the fight that they wanted to put on, Mike Swick against Matt Serra, and I guess Mike needs surgery on his arm. So that's going to be an issue there. So they have to come up with a main event. But you know what? Dana is playing hardball in this thing because anytime that you put a fight show, not only on the same night, but in the same city that your competitor is doing it, I mean, you're playing hardball. You really want to go to the mat with them. Whether that means taking a fight off a card that's already been slated for, say, a pay-per-view card and making it the main event of that fight night, they're really going to work at making sure that that show is good.
Now, the 17th obviously was optional for CBS and Strikeforce. We heard they were meeting on Monday. Have you heard anything? Is there a possibility they are going to move it back to the 24th, or are they just set in stone? They're going on the 17th.
I personally think they're going to move it. Right now they're still debating it. They're getting down to a time where they're going to have to make a decision. The decision, as far as I know, yet has not been made. But I personally think they're going to move it because that would be their best move. Number one, being in the same city as the UFC on the same night, it's going to be hard for them to sell tickets. At the very least, they'd have to give tickets away, which I'm sure they don't want to do. It's going to make it financially difficult for them. And they can take a little jab at the WEC because, Strikeforce has a fairly good card. They got some good fights on that card. And if you put free fights on network TV compared to outstanding fights that are going to be WEC shows but charging $45, $55, most people in this economy are going to choose free. So, I think that Strikeforce is going to move it. CBS will put it on April 24th, and UFC will show in Nashville, which then I wonder if it gets canceled.
So let's go back to the beginning of the conversation, which was James Toney. So if he fights in, June or July, who's the probable matchup?
Well, it's going to be interesting. I mean, the matchup that I suggested was Louise Kane. Kind of greeted a little coldly by Dana White. His response to me is he got knocked out by a little nog. But I think a guy of that ilk is the kind of guy that Toney should fight. Because here's what I think, Steve. He's far too experienced a professional fighter than Kimbo. I think Kimbo has obviously more experience in MMA, but Toney's got 80-some professional fights, and, it would be a stand-up fight. I think Toney would be favored in that. But when you start talking about a guy like Randy Couture, I mean, it goes too far the other way. Couture is just too good of an MMA fighter that I think for Toney at this stage of his career to put a guy in his debut in against a Hall of Fame fighter in the UFC. So I think what they need to do is they need to find a guy that is primarily a stand-up fighter, but who has some other dimensions to his game. And that's where I came up with Louise Kane. Hey, he's not the best light heavyweight in the UFC, but he's a good, solid, fighter. He is coming off a loss, but he's a guy that, he's won some fights. He's, I think, 10-2, 11-2, guy that has a little bit of diversity in his game, and he's a true mixed martial artist. If Toney beats that guy, hey, you know what? He might have something, and it's a building block, and I think that's the kind of guy he should fight. if they don't want to put him in against Toney because he lost, there are other guys of similar stature that I think they could do.
And let's get it straight. UFC, I don't think, is bringing him in to make an example of him. And talking to Dana White, you said that he likes James. He actually thinks he can do some good things. Here's the other issue. Is there a licensing issue if it's in Nevada, which I would assume would be the most stringent in terms of the matchup, where they wouldn't license a matchup?
You know what, Nevada, you would think that Nevada would do it, but Nevada licensed Evander Holyfield. So, I mean, basically, I think what we're seeing with Nevada is the standards have been loosened. And so, you know, I wouldn't anticipate any problems with James getting licensed. I mean, he's been an active professional fighter, fought last year in California, which has a very strict and stringent athletic commission, fought with no problems. I think that they would license him. Would they license him against Couture? You know, I mean, I think they would go through the dog and pony show and maybe you know, make him jump through hoops. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, they would allow it.
All right, Kev, good job. We'll check in with you later in the week.
Thank you, Steve.